I'm Mark Fiske, and you're listening to Clear the Air. I think most public secondary school music teachers will tell you that they consider it an asset to get to work with students over 6 or 7 or 8 years. I know I did. Unfortunately, when I reached the back half of my career, which makes some sense considering knowing those students for half of their school lives, almost half their lives, students would sometimes share their concerns and sometimes even their traumatic experiences. That was one of the saddest things I've ever seen, but something as a mandatory reporter I was powerless to do anything about except listen and then report to the appropriate experts. I think a few public secondary school administrators would admit that some of the teachers of other subjects were jealous of the kinds of opportunities for growth that extended time created, and I think fewer still would admit that they colluded with teachers or coaches and their school boards to try to introduce things that were designed to break up or interfere with students' intentions to continue to participate in those classes and groups for 6 or 7 or 8 years. I'm fortunate to have been honored in different ways by my students, dozens of students over the years. I've been asked to write job recommendations and college recommendations, asked to walk with or speak for them at recognitions, and I've been invited to college graduations and weddings. In my case, a student who joined a band at the beginning and stayed through graduation left with an 8-year experience, and having had multiple opportunities to display strengths, weaknesses, likes and dislikes, personality, humor, and attitudes, and leaving me with multiple opportunities to consider and respond to all of those things. I would say that around year 16, which for me was in 2016, the number of new things or behaviors to respond to seemed to drop off considerably, which meant less time spent trying to figure things out and more time working on making things great. There were always students who seemed genuinely happy about the work we were doing, and in most of those cases, their parents agreed. There were always a few students who seemed to genuinely hate the work we were doing, and in most of those cases, their parents agreed. But like I said back in episode 3, those kids were typically outnumbered and actually often stayed in the bands that they joined. Then there was a third group, and I admit that I failed to identify this group until toward the end of my public education career. That third group on the surface appeared to be part of the genuinely happy students. But in the case of this group, their parents were absolutely not happy about the work we were doing. So if you'll humor me, I have some observations and theories I'm going to share with you about that group. It wasn't uncommon for those households to end up demanding a conference. But they were always very confused when I would reveal that their kids seemed to be enjoying band and having a great time. I found it interesting, and you might too, that in almost all those cases, those households had only daughters, so no sons. And so what I believe was happening is that these young ladies may have at first thought there was no issue sharing their enthusiasm for what was happening in band, but then sometimes for a father who had hoped for sons in sports and football and wrestling, there wasn't support for that enthusiasm. So we'd have this disjointed, confusing environment created where the kid learned that at home they were expected to complain about something they really liked. I value openness, and when I got the opportunity, I would even share that with band members who appeared to hate being there, but I always felt the worst for the kids who seemed really happy at band practice but were expected to talk about how much they hated it when they got to the dinner table. And I've always hoped those kids find their voices as adults. Unless we're talking about a very specific type of personality disorder, no one can claim or would even think about claiming that they were perfect. So there were mistakes made because we all make them. In hindsight, I could have done a much better job much earlier of expressing my thoughts on what I thought my role was as a band director. I would have been more outspoken about how cruel I thought it was, because I think it was, for a school district to restrict their participation in the kinds of activities we should have been encouraging just because they failed a random drug test after being quarantined and locked down indefinitely. In the context of what was happening, those students all thought or were worried or at least were considering that might have been the end of the world. I should have been more clear about the air gap that needs to exist between the student groups and the parent support group. Parent booster groups are great when the roles are delineated, but when the lines start getting blurred by volunteers who try to assume responsibilities outside of fundraising and chaperoning, They're failing to consider that their homeowner's policy probably doesn't have enough coverage to cover an accident or injury to a student, and that there are things that should be left to the professional with the training because they're the professional with training and coverage. I wish I knew or had thought that I could pull public records at a citizen parent while I was still teaching, because I might have been able to head off large swaths of what became considerations for leaving. I told my students for decades that someone's last name didn't do anything to make them more valuable than someone without it, and that what they learned to do or offered to do for others was what made them valuable, and I failed to recognize that I was inviting challenges by students and households whose bread and butter was to take advantage of their last names. In those last couple of years, I regret speaking in code, which was sometimes necessary in order to be discreet, but absolutely not fair to kids who are in the fight of their lives trying to figure everything out. And finally, this is hard to say out loud. I should not have let my own children get close to my band members. A high school kid can appear to be well-meaning, and even actually be well-meaning, but in more than one example, high school kids we thought were good examples made promises that, as people who might not ever even come back to the town they grew up in, there was no way they were ever going to keep. And that was a heartbreak to my children that I could have done more to prevent.